So we're delighted to be here for the fourth VCOSS post-budget breakfast with the Treasurer. It's fantastic to be seeing you in person, Treasurer. Again, it feels like I know we only had our last budget last November, but it's been such a strange sort of 15 months, and we're always incredibly appreciative of your time. And it's now my absolute pleasure to hand over to Mary Gearan, ABC News presenter, senior reporter, and extraordinaire on all things news related, and again, another fantastic supporter of the community sector. So a sincere welcome, Mary. We are thrilled to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Emma, and I am absolutely thrilled to be here. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. It's an absolute thrill to be here because I have been trying to, get into some of those issues that have been right in our faces over the past year. Your lives, your bread and butter, your issues have been the most important stories for us over the past year and a half. Can't imagine what your years have been like, really. So it's really a thrill to be here today, to talk to you apart from anything else, and also to, digest these beautiful breakfast along with the Victorian budget as well. So thank you, and thank you to everyone who's joining us from home as well. So it's another Victorian budget, come and gone, as you say, the second in just 6 months. And the public focus so far has been this massive spend, $3.8 billion on mental health, how it'll be funded. Today is an opportunity for all of us to dig a bit deeper, to scratch the surface of that, and also any other budget elements that you want to talk about today. Things that were in the budget, of course, but also the things that weren't in the budget. Very shortly, we'll be asking the Treasurer to present a short overview of the budget, a particular focus obviously on its social policy initiatives. Then it's your turn. We'll be asking you to put questions from the floor, also from those who are watching remotely. And if that is you, you can submit a question in the Slido box underneath the video. I'm told by Ryan here that that's going to happen. I had to be introduced to Slido, but I'm assured that it's very, very easy and very, very obvious. We're also running a word association poll on Slido right now. Maybe we can put it on pieces of paper here in the room. In one word, describe how you feel about last Thursday's budget. Can you do it in one word? Maybe we'll take two. Will we take two? We'll take a hyphenated word. So we're going to check back later and see how that word cloud looks. And maybe we'll get Tim Pallas to make his own word association as well. But it's now my pleasure to welcome Tim Pallas up to the microphone and to give us his remarks.
Thanks very much, Mary. It gives me great pleasure to be here again this morning. I think it's my fourth, and I really do look forward to this event. And before I get into that, I should, of course, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So thank you very much to VCOSS for organising this event yet again. And I think it's a great day to be here today to celebrate a lot of the priorities that are lived large in this budget. They speak volumes of our collective desire for improving our society and to make it fairer. So last week, Emma described the 21 budget as a blueprint for Victoria's post-COVID recovery. As you all know, VCOSS aims to create a better, fairer and more just Victoria, and this budget is our blueprint for recovery. It strives to do just that, building on the record $49 billion worth of investment in last year's budget. I can't tell you how traumatising it is to put together two budgets in 6 months for a Treasurer. But I can also tell you it's been a really interesting contrast in styles, these two budgets. You'd appreciate that the last budget, there was no touchstone in terms of what the full consequence of the economic event that we were living through, but there was absolute certainty within government that governments needed to spend and spend in a targeted and a considered way to try and make sure that the community was well catered for, that business were provided for, and ultimately that those who were suffering the most as a consequence of the economic event that we were living through, let alone the health event, were provided for and were first and foremost in our thinking. So by supporting those struggling, by delivering care where it's needed most, we intend still supporting thousands of jobs at the same time. And that includes building our mental health system from the ground up and recognising in many ways that that system is broken and it's not serving the needs of the community. Certainly, I suppose the first thing you can do if you've got a problem, you've got to admit you've got it. And that's the first step towards restitution and recovery. This budget will invest more of the services and the support that Victorians need, helping our hospitals and our health system recover, ensuring a brighter future for our kids, delivering the road, the rail that our state needs, and investing in the strong, connected communities that our state needs. The investments made in this budget will support, on average, about 38,000 jobs every year over the next 4 years. I want to start by giving you a quick idea of how Victoria is tracking economically. In 2018-19, the last financial year before the pandemic hit, Victoria's economy was growing strongly at 3.1%. The pandemic had a significant impact on Victoria's economy. However, the recovery is now underway and the outlook is positive. Business and consumer confidence are elevated. Household balance sheets in aggregate are strong and monetary policy remains highly supportive. Victorian GSP is forecast to increase by 6.5% in 21-22 with strong growth forecast right over the forward estimates period. The government's jobs plan, which was announced as part of the 2020-21 budget in November, included a target to create 400,000 jobs by 2025, with half of those being in place by the end of 2022. Now, the strength of the Victorian economic recovery really means that those interim targets were somewhat conservative in their form. They've already been met, with more than 243,000 jobs having been created in Victoria since the lowest point in the economic cycle, which was September of last year. Employment has recovered to its pre-pandemic levels, and Victoria's employment recovery is broadly caught up with the rest of Australia. If you look at the latest Australian Bureau of Statistics, Victoria now has more people in employment than we did pre-pandemic. Same can't be said for New South Wales, the gold standard, I'm told. So women and young workers are more likely to work in industries that have been most affected during the pandemic, such as accommodation and food services. But the economic recovery's been particularly strong for women and young people. Female employment's recovered strongly to now be relatively higher than male employment compared to the March 2020 levels. Now that's despite female employment falling by more than male employment during 2020. In addition, the proportion of young people in employment has now recovered to around the pre-pandemic levels. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about something that I get very excited about, and you'll have to indulge me because treasurers don't get excited about much. And I'm going to tell you a story about a new accounting methodology. So strap yourselves in, this will be very exciting. We know early intervention is a smarter way to use public funds and to help Victorians. Victoria is investing in reforms that put people at the centre of service delivery, continuing the transformation of how the government delivers services to people with a shift towards early intervention and diversion. An early intervention approach informs major initiatives in this budget, including the government's response to the Royal Commission into Victorians' mental health system. The budget invests in early intervention and shows the government is focused on pursuing interventions that improve outcomes and reduce acute service usage into the long term. The government's committed to gradually shifting the service system to provide more early interventions. To further the reform, the budget supports the development of an early intervention investment framework. It's an approach that links investment to measurable impacts, and quite frankly, it's common sense in action. Those of you who've participated in the partnerships addressing disadvantage in this sector would know that the government is increasingly focused on partnerships and increasingly focused on reward for outcomes, recognising that if we work together, we can get better outcomes. Approximately half of all Victorians will experience poor mental health in their lifetime. Yet for far too long, that suffering just hasn't been taken seriously enough. It's why we established the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system and why we're delivering the biggest social reform in a generation, building our mental health system from the ground up. While we might think that the cost of fixing the system is too great, the cost of not fixing it is, of course, even greater. Last budget, we provided $869 million, the then single biggest investment in mental health Victoria has seen, to start the work of fixing our mental health system. Now we're delivering $3.8 billion to truly transform the way that mental health and wellbeing support is offered throughout our state. Together, of course, these investments will create something like 3,000 new jobs. $954 million will go towards establishing 22 reformed area mental health and wellbeing services to replace current services. $370 million will go towards improving access to mental health beds and better acute care for Victorians living with mental illness. Fixing our mental health system will take time, and of course the Royal Commission warned us about that, and they warned about the shifting attention of government. So we need a process to ensure that that attention is ongoing and has a substantial longevity. And of course the sum total of these investments is a significant step in delivering on the recommendations of the Royal Commission, because we know that it will save lives. Ensuring we protect the long-term future of this funding, a new dedicated revenue measure is included in this year's budget in accordance with the recommendations of the Royal Commission. The Mental Health and Wellbeing Levy will apply to businesses with wages paid in Victoria by businesses with more than $10 million in wages nationally from the 1st of January 2022. We know that the earlier that we can reach someone struggling with mental health, the better the life outcomes will be. That's particularly true when it comes to our kids. It's why we're investing $842 million in mental health and wellbeing support for children and young people, ensuring we're providing support to them and their families as early as possible. The investment will see two separate streams of care created, one devoted to infants and children between the ages of 0 to 11, and one devoted to young people, aged 12 to 25. An investment of $138 million will deliver 13 reformed infant, child and family mental health and wellbeing services, providing local support that's specifically designed around the needs of children and young people. And we're also investing $266 million to reform and expand youth area mental health and wellbeing services right across Victoria, and to support organisations providing mental health care to young people. Regional Victoria will benefit enormously from this reform to the mental health system. We know that there is a critical need to address poor access to services in rural and regional areas. That's why, as part of this package, an estimated $700 million will go to regional mental health support services. More funding will go to new and expanded regional mental health services that can make services available to every corner of the state. Funding is included for local services in Benalla, Greater Geelong, Latrobe Valley, and they're due to open in 2022. And if our mental health system is going to work for Victorians with mental health illness, it will also need to work for their families, for their carers and supporters as well. This budget provides some $93 million to ensure the voices of families are heard at the heart of our system, including family and carer-led centres in 8 regions across Victoria to provide professional help for families and to connect them with the right services. We're also providing dedicated funding to improve regional access, like the $11 million Rural and Regional Workforce Incentive Scheme, attracting, training and recruiting more mental health professionals to our regional communities. We're also making sure that every dollar of investment is doing double duty, supporting Victorians in need and supporting the establishment of stable jobs for Victorians. It's an approach that really underpins the philosophy that is at the heart of this budget. Building on our $1.4 billion investment last year, this budget provides $1.2 billion to protect our children and to help keep vulnerable families together. Not only will these investments improve the lives of children and families around Victoria, they'll also support around 1,000 additional jobs across the state. A further $354 million is being provided to support victims, survivors and address family violence, and also continue implementing the recommendations for the Royal Commission into family violence. $194 million will go towards homelessness services, focusing on people who need help in the rental market, young people leaving care, and vulnerable Victorians with complex needs. Over the past 6 years, the government's delivered $21.6 billion to give our kids a quality education. Our November budget stepped in with statewide tutoring programs to help kids catch up, and we made a record $5.6 billion investment into education. This year's budget invests a total of $3.5 billion in education, helping to make sure that every Victorian child gets a great start in life. Some of the key investments included in the budget in the education area include $1.6 billion to deliver new schools and upgrades to existing ones, $277 million to deliver a comprehensive range of reforms to put students' health, their mental health and well-being at the centre of school communities, $185 million to support our teaching workforce, and $167 million to continue the rollout of 3-year-old kinder, which I'm pleased to say, as a consequence of the investment contained in this budget, will be available in every local government area in the state. We know that the pandemic has had a lasting impact on our entire health system. As we continue to recover from the pandemic, this budget delivers $7.1 billion to continue improving our hospitals and our healthcare. $3.7 billion in funding will help meet demand for hospital services, including more emergency department staff, extra highly specialised therapies, and support for new wards as they open. There's a further $1.3 billion to continue our public health response to COVID-19, backing the ongoing efforts of our contact tracers and public health team, while also supporting Australia's vaccine rollout in the state. To help alleviate the pressure of our emergency departments, the budget will deliver more than $759 million in funding for more paramedics, more triage care and support staff for Ambulance Victoria, as well as targeted funding to improve flow of patients in our busy emergency departments. Community-based health services will also receive an extra $91 million in support, including help to catch up on treatments that Victorians deferred during the course of the pandemic, including things like public dental health, cancer diagnosis and screening, and maternal and child health. And $50 million will support the establishment of Victoria's capability of manufacturing mRNA vaccines. But we know that we can't undo history, but if we face up to it with courage, we can make a better future. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have long called for treaty and self-determination. A fairer future for Victoria relies on a fairer future for our First Peoples. Across the state, $448 million will directly support Aboriginal Victorians, including supporting self-determination and our state's treaty process. This represents the single biggest investment in support for our Aboriginal communities. It includes $160 million of support for mental health and wellbeing services for Aboriginal Victorians. $58 million will support the establishment of the Yuruk Justice Commission and support the First Peoples Assembly. Of course, this is not just a budget that invests in services. Jobs continue to be a priority for this government, as it has been in each and every budget that we've delivered. $288 million will further strengthen our reputation as our nation's creative capital, including $121 million to transform Victoria's screen industry by growing jobs, developing some homegrown talent, or more homegrown talent, and promoting our people and content to the world. $209 million will further support our TAFE and training sector and includes up to 12,000 extra subsidised training places rather. In addition, $86 million will establish the brand new Victorian Skills Authority, bringing together industry providers and other stakeholders to identify priority training areas. $179 million will deliver the first stage of the transformation of the former GM8 site in Fisherman's Bend into a global innovation hub. And $160 million will highlight Victoria's strengths as a visitor destination and rebuild the Victorian visitor economy brand. Regional communities, which underpin Victoria's economy and our state's prosperities, have also been very much a focus of the budget. They're incredibly diverse, of course, from dryland agriculture to tourism, to new energy, advanced manufacturing, from big cities to small towns. From schools to hospitals, road and rail, we've strengthened our economy by ensuring no Victorian gets left behind during our repair of the Victorian economy post-pandemic. All up, we're investing $3.7 billion to support regional economies to get back on their feet and back on track by creating jobs for all Victorians. And this builds on the $26 billion worth of investment in regional Victoria since we were elected in November 2014. So that's more than 3 times the amount that the previous government delivered for regional Victoria. So before I conclude, just an ad. I want to encourage everybody to donate to Kids Undercover. This is a tradition that I put in place ever since I became Treasurer, and that is for us to spend a little bit of time every time we talk about astronomical numbers. We start talking about the human implication of the choices that we make. As you know, every year I nominate a charity as the state's budget charity, and I make a personal contribution. No state funds have been directed here. So I encourage you to support this worthy cause. And as we deliver these investments, we'll be creating tens of thousands of new jobs, and with it, a bright future for tens of thousands of Victorian families. And it's a simple proposition that underpins the philosophy of this budget, ensuring every dollar of investment is delivering a double benefit, making our state stronger and fairer, and getting more people back to work to make it happen. That's been our record over the past 6 years, and that approach will be what drives our recovery. The budget invests in the plan and the projects Victorians need and the Victorians we need to deliver them. With this budget, we're creating jobs and caring for Victorians. And I'm looking forward to some questions.
I think the plan is for us to stand up, is that right? So we can have the people at home listen to your words with full volume. And obviously, if you are watching from home, please do use the Slido. Just go down past the video, and it's obvious. And in this room as well, obviously, we're going to have some roving mics around, and you'll have your chance to ask the Treasurer some questions. So first, I'll just kick things off. Thank you very much for taking us through that, Treasurer. Let's talk about that levy. You've been copping some heat from some quarters we could have predicted as well. Can we just confirm, it's not explicit, but you haven't said otherwise, it is an ongoing part of the Victorian economy from now on? It's baked in?
It is. I have been asked this question a few times. Certainly what the Royal Commission into Mental Health said was that they expected government to put in place a funding stream to ensure that there was continued capacity but also a continuing contribution from the state in an ongoing sense. So with the state taxation legislation, which is a normal part of the budget process, I've also included the new mental health and wellbeing levy, the purpose of which is to ensure that if you're a national employer and you have a wages bill over $10 million, you qualify for the first tranche of the payment, which is 0.5% in effect. And if you're a national employer with a wages bill over $100 million, a further 0.5%.
And industry's said that this will cost businesses, that businesses will go under or move interstate. Do you not accept that argument at all, or do you accept that that will have to happen for the sake of this investment?
Well, I don't accept the proposition, and the reason I don't is what we know from the Mental Health Royal Commission's findings is that the economic cost to the state of our mental health problems is quite insidious. It's about $14 billion a year. That's a $14 billion retardant upon the full achievement of the potential of the Victorian economy. Second point I'd make is to business. We know, once again, from the work that the Royal Commission did, that there is about a $1.9 billion per annum cost to business because of the problems of mental health. We know, for example, that there's higher levels of absenteeism, higher levels of workplace injury as a consequence. The final point I'd make is that in terms of comparison or competitive comparison, our headline rate for payroll tax is still considerably below New South Wales, which returns to a 5.45% payroll tax levy on the 1st of July next year. Our rate will still be below that for employers between the payroll salaries of $10 million up to about $115 million. So
do you
essentially,
accept that some of these businesses are saying they're still recovering from the pandemic?
well, they're recovering very quickly. If you look at the figures, our GDP is growing about twice the speed of the nation's at the moment. We've created about 50% of all the jobs in the nation at the moment. So from the pandemic perspective, I think, yes, there is some continuing difficulties in the community, but let's recognise that the first and most apparent challenge that we have to confront is the wellbeing of Victorians, and as a consequence, as Victorians are properly catered for, I'm sure our businesses will perform a lot more efficiently as well.
There are going to be more than 3,000 jobs in the mental health sector, it's said, and you addressed in your remarks about attracting them to regional areas in particular. There are concerns within the sector that there aren't enough skilled people. How are you going to attract and support workforce? It won't happen quickly. How quickly are you assuming that will happen?
Well, you're absolutely right, Mary. It won't happen overnight, and the best way to get it fixed is get started, and that's our approach to this. We know that there's going to be at least 3,000 jobs that will be required, and we know it will be particularly difficult in regional Victoria. We know that because we've seen the problems that the NDIS has confronted, particularly in regional Victoria. One of the things that the government is doing is, of course, it's skilling and attraction strategies, particularly for regional Victoria, and the funds that we put aside there. The other thing we need to recognise is that as a government we prioritise the need to invest in skills that the economy needs. Hence our TAFE system receives an extra $200 million in this budget, but what we've been putting in place is free TAFE for targeted areas where we need to skill up the workforce. That is us as a government making a very strategic view about what are the skills we need for the economy going forward. Clearly, the skills in mental health, to the extent that they can be facilitated through TAFE, will be an important part. But of course, a lot of these skills will be required to be accessed through university grade education, and we'll have to have a continuing discussion with the Commonwealth about appropriate placement numbers for that. But we will also need to recognise, as we did in the early 2000s when we had a massive shortage of medical staff, particularly nurses, the state's going to have to become a lot more aggressive in terms of its desire to attract those sort of skills to the state.
When it comes to housing, your social housing commitments obviously are laudable, but they're only a fraction of the waiting lists that do exist. Does the government have an aim to get that list down to zero? If not, why not? And if so, when are you going to get there?
Well, I suppose politicians can talk about their targets and their aims. It's generally their money that convinces you that they're serious about it. And from a government perspective, of course, our commitment to $5.6 billion worth of investment into our public housing system, I suppose, is the biggest single investment that any government has made in the history of this country, and it demonstrates that we're about trying to create not only jobs in this industry, but also dealing with the evident backlog that exists. And to put it into context, I think Federal Labor recently announced they were going to have a $10 billion public housing strategy, which I think is a great first start. But when you compare it to the level of effort, we're about 26% of the nation's economy, and we're proposing in this one-off contribution to actually massively increase for our share of the population. It's about double what that Federal Labor contribution is. Now, please don't interpret that as criticism. It's great to see finally at a federal level somebody starting to take the needs of public housing seriously. But from our perspective, the opportunity to partner with a federal government that's serious about housing those in need, I think will be vitally important. The other point I'd make is this is not a recent affectation of this government. Our Homes for Victorians policy, our housing growth fund strategies, our strategies to make renting fairer, our strategies aimed at ensuring that, of course, we waive for properties under a certain value, 700,000. I think the stamp duty imposts upon first home buyers, it's all about giving people choices, but recognising some, particularly those most disadvantaged, people escaping domestic violence, as one classic illustration, we have to be constantly attentive to that. And one of the areas we've spent a lot of time and effort focusing on is homelessness as a government, and this budget continues that enormous effort and work that will be required effectively to find homes for people who find themselves in a situation of homelessness.
And social housing is so much a part of that. Just as a quick follow-up to that then, beyond this one-off, as you say, there aren't any other targets going forward, there aren't any other plans in the pipeline?
Not from the 5.6 billion we've just announced, but believe me, I work very closely with the Housing Minister, and he's never satisfied. He's a very ambitious Housing Minister, and look, we think there are areas of intervention that we can refine and improve, and, might I say, extend our effort. One of the areas I'm particularly thrilled with is the $500 million we put to shared equity. This idea that those who are unable to access adequate loan facilities and their capacity to accumulate sufficient to get the funds to get on that first rung of home ownership, where the state effectively takes an equity share in the property and only recoups its share at the point of sale. We're doing a lot more around how we can help people find ways into the housing market.
And just one last one from me before we open it up as well. So keep putting those questions on Slido as well, and there are those mics. Grab. Yep. Put your hand up very soon. But one last one from me for the moment. The gender responsive budgeting unit that you've set up in Treasury to look at essentially the scorecard for women on all of the measures. I'm particularly interested in whether that's going to be public, whether now every time you announce something, there's going to be basically the women's scorecard that comes out with it.
It's interesting. I hadn't really developed my thinking to that level of detail, but what the aim is here is, of course, every budget we produce a gender lens, a women's statement effectively around how we've dealt with our responsibilities in the budget. Far too often, I think, you can fall into the trap of it just being tick a box, and 50% of the population have been accommodated because, well, occupations that are predominantly female have been accounted for. Well, that's all well and good, but they serve a need for the entire community. So what we've tended to, what we are now looking at is every time we make a decision in government, we have a gender lens attached to it. Think about the consequences of the decisions you make. And far too often, I think, if you look at the way that, for example, superannuation in this country has been managed, not overtly, but by the implications of the material circumstances under which women predominantly work compared to men, you have this embedded disadvantage. And you need somebody to bell that cat every time people are making what on their face appear to be reasonable decisions, but don't look through the real world implications of the circumstances that is different between the way that men and women work and their respective responsibilities in terms of childcare and caregiving more generally. So practically speaking, if we're going to get a fairer community, we've got to be conscious of the consequences of decisions we make in a very overt way. So firstly, the aim is to make sure decision makers are aware of the implications of it. I don't see that there are any difficulties with the state at the time also issuing a broad statement, one, that we've taken this into account, and two, what we believe the implications would be. Because at the very least, it holds government to account for the choices they make.
A broad statement, would it be, how transparent are you committing to be in that? Should we be seeing all of it? Should we not be seeing exactly what the decision makers are seeing?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what we'll be seeing. I suppose I'll have to wait to see how the unit transpires, but I don't have any difficulty making the processes of judgment that government is going through available to the community. I mean, that's essentially, it's public money at the end of the day, and what we're doing here is trying to make sure that decision making is better and fairer and more transparent to the community. So how we do it in a way that is digestible and doesn't breach any confidences around cabinet decision making, I'm up for a conversation about how we do that to meet the needs, not only of the community more generally, but so that women in the community can have some confidence that government is not only making decisions properly informed, but we're doing it in a way that's sufficiently transparent that they're confident that we're doing it and doing it properly.
Terrific. Everyone loves some public information. Thank you very much for that, Treasurer. Now, who would like to ask the Treasurer a question in the room? Over here.
Thank you, Treasurer. Paul McDonald, Anglicare Victoria, and first of all, congratulations on the budget. It's the riches that you put up there in relation to social impact will be very significant. You've always been a treasurer that's had an eye on downstream costs, and can we back that up with social impact bonds and home stretch course and mental health? I'm wondering, in that early intervention framework that you're suggesting Treasury starts thinking about, maybe I think you're suggesting a change of thinking, or when you approach about how to start to view government spending, I'm wondering if you could just expand a little bit for the audience here about that thinking and what you're hoping to achieve in relation to that. Thanks.
Sure. Now, I can bore for Australia on this, and I'll try my best to make it vaguely interesting, but the New Zealand government has started a process which, if not a world first, I think is pretty much well up there, their wellbeing budget strategies. And what it seeks to do is effectively make sure that at the time you're making a choice about how you budget for something, you don't distort the value of the acute presentation because it's here and now and you have an urgency attaching to it, as opposed to the value of early intervention. So, as you'd appreciate, if we make early interventions, we avoid acute presentations. So rather than distort the preference always to acute presentations, you try and get that balance right. So, for example, whether it's homelessness or youth exposure to the justice system and how we avoid that, whether it's drug and alcohol treatment and prevention, government needs to be able to set up mechanisms to weigh the value of those early interventions as opposed to the acute presentation. And at the moment, of course, far too often, because we've got a burning platform, as it were, in terms of acute needs, government feeds that immediate problem. So what we're trying to do through this framework is effectively say, well, what does a 4-year, a 6-year, a 10-year period of investment look like, and what is the return to the budget of those early interventions? And the best way to get economists and accountants to like investments of this nature is to be able to adequately equip them and show that there is a return for that investment. Some of the investments that we've made in this budget, we've been able to identify what the savings to the state will be over a 4-year period if we intervene now. Now, I'd be the first to admit that it requires a fair bit more refinement, and I think we find something in the vicinity of about $100 million worth of savings by investing early and making substantial contributions. But if you think about the rationale underpinning this, if we can get the way to equip this properly, then we don't distort our choices and therefore distort what should be the basic proposition. Now, everybody knows the old saying of a stitch in time saves 9. Well, that's exactly what we're trying to do here in an accounting sense.
It's better word than a word cloud, isn't it? Having some applause.
Hi, Robin Gregory from Women's Health West. Also fabulous budget, lots of fantastic things. Great to see the lapsing funding for family violence services and other initiatives included as well. On the kind of not so happy end of things, a couple of years ago at this breakfast, I brought to your attention the disparity in unit price funding for specialist family violence services for victim survivors. And you very kindly organised a meeting quickly, and we looked at the changes that would happen. Just for other people's information, specialist services for victim survivors of family violence are funded at a lower rate than other comparable services, child and family, sexual assault. men's perpetrator programs, somewhat ironically, the new Orange Door services as well, which has led to intense competition even internally within our own services. I was really disappointed to see that after 2 years of bringing this to the government's attention that still hasn't changed. And also noting that Women's Health West, for example, had a 12.5% increase just of police referrals alone during the COVID year, and that hasn't abated, with both March and April showing record numbers of 1,200 police referrals. I'm wondering about the thinking and the plans to ensure that disparity, from the 1st of July this year, we have a mandatory minimum qualification for social work, yet we're still being funded with the assumption of a level 4, SCADS level 4 pay point 1 sitting behind our service. I knew it was going to be a tight budget, but was really expecting that change to occur, so I'm interested in thoughts about next steps.
Sure, Rob. And thanks. There's one thing, I pretty much well predicted I might have a question from you today, because you're consistent, if nothing else. First point I have to make, and I'm not sure it's necessarily going to be a particularly popular one, but I do have to wind back the level of output expenditure that the state has on the public side, and you'll see in this budget that I've made a very deliberate attempt to try and avoid that pain being endured essentially through broader community services, but something like $2.7 billion worth of output expenditure is being wound back in this budget, and it's in part due to the need to demonstrate to the community that when we ask business and others to make a contribution towards the services that we provide to the community, particularly at this time, we're doing it in a way that we're not exempting ourselves in terms of the efficiency of government spend. And of course, as I've said, $1.2 billion for child protection, child support, the fact that we're putting in place what I think are very substantial family prevention and prevention of family violence measures, $354 million. And so far as victim support, some $54.6 million that we're putting in place to improve our response for victim survivors. I accept that that will mean that, yes, there is more money being put into these areas. We can have a conversation about how efficiently that money is being applied, and I'm happy for a continuing discussion to occur about what constitutes an appropriate level of investment from the state in the services that you provide, which I make I won't beat around the bush. It is a vitally important services that you provide, so we're happy to talk to you about it. But I do have to do this in a way that is conscious of the fact that the state needs to manage its output expenditure as efficiently as it can. So we'll work with you to see exactly what needs you have and where you feel that these services are being unfairly dealt with. There's a substantial amount of increased investment in the areas where the problem is manifest. The question is whether we're doing that sufficiently efficiently and whether or not you believe that the choices that we've made in this budget, so far as they affect you and your responsibilities into the community, are fair. I just ask you to bear in mind that the government does have to try and reduce the level of output exposure that we have so that we can get more funds to provide for these services more generally across the community. But more than happy to have a discussion with you about that.
And Treasurer, it sounds like you'll be held accountable next year as well. So,
looks like.
A quick follow-up on that, just related to that. There's still this, I'm going to call it a problem, of drip funding for services within the budget. As we know, that puts a lot of pressure on staff and puts a lot of pressure on policy making and on civic conversation. The number of organisations I've spoken to say they can't speak out because they can't criticise the government because they're afraid of biting the hand that feeds them. What would you have to say about that being a focus potentially to improve on, to give these good people the certainty they need?
Well, the first thing I'd say is people should not feel concerned about criticising the government. I've seen a few who've been more than happy to criticise the government in the context of this budget. Look, we're robust. We are not malicious as a government. We are intending, as best we can, to have a conversation with the community about where our priorities lie in circumstances where, you know, we do have to get to a position where I can demonstrate budget repair. And quite frankly, a number of my ministerial colleagues have had to bear some of the brunt of that, and the state is now able to say by 22-23 we'll be in an operating cash surplus. Who'd have thought we could have done that in circumstances where we've spent $49 billion extra in November and another $26 billion extra now. So we're working the dollars hard. The second point I'd make, Mary, is for the first time this government is moving away from the idea of people falling off the edge of a cliff when it comes to government funding. Now, I can't say it applies everywhere, but the idea of a year or two of funding and then at the end of it you fall off a cliff, we're moving increasingly to, if it is output expenditure and if it is reasonably expected that those funds will continue on, I'd prefer to bite the bullet and accept that rather than turn it into a year or 2 year and then basically I'm then facing a cliff that I've got to fund in the budget. So from my perspective, making the hard decision up front and funding it for a full 4 years over a forward estimates period doesn't create this false sense of economic rigour. If you know what I mean, you sit back and you look at your forward estimates and go, oh, I'm doing pretty well, apart from the fact that there's billions of dollars that I fail to take into account, that unless, of course, I don't want to provide family violence services into the community, I'm going to have to fund anyway. So from a government point of view, in this budget, we are slowly but surely doing away with those funding cliffs, as it were. So increasingly, a lot of organisations will start to see that through the choices that the government are making in this budget and future budgets.
I know we've got more questions here on the floor, but this one from Andrew via Slido. The budget projects that unemployment will be 5.5% in 22-23, substantially higher than the projected national rate, 4.75%. Have you made a deliberate decision to prioritise budget repair over full employment?
No, not at all. I would have thought, if anything, this government's demonstrated its choices and its values through the investments that it makes to create employment. First of all, I'd say I wouldn't take too seriously federal government budget forecasts. They've tended not to be particularly accurate, and they've tended to be more professions of political faith than they are serious documents. And the point I'd make is I don't produce our budget forecasts. Treasury produce them, and they have to get them signed off by the Auditor General. Last year, when the Auditor General looked at our assessments, he took external advice to see if we were accurate. The federal government doesn't do that. They just make them up. And like, I hope they have a fair crack at them being accurate, but in practical terms, we think we do have to certainly forecast in a conservative sense, because essentially if our forecasts are wrong and we've been overly optimistic, then the practical consequence of that is that the community will find that there'll be shortfalls in revenue inflows. But practically speaking, I think this hits the balance right. It's a transparent process of forecasting. It is entirely in contradistinction to the process that the federal government apply. But more importantly, I just draw people's attention to our record when it comes to employment creation. I mean, we have created 240,000 jobs since September of last year. That is far and away the lion's share of jobs created in this nation, and that we now have more jobs in the Victorian economy today than we had in February last year. That is at the time of the onset of the pandemic. So something's working.
We have a question here.
Good morning, Treasurer. Nicole Rees from autism organisation Amaze. Hello.
Hey, Nicole.
A follow-on really about the strong jobs growth that we are experiencing, together with the skills and labour shortages that we have and are emerging. And a paradox, I suppose, is that there are pockets of the community who are really experiencing very high levels of joblessness. And I'm thinking particularly about the autism community. Autistic people overwhelmingly want to work, and they have, there's a huge deal of untapped potential that could be really leveraged in the current circumstances. So what I wanted to ask was, what do you see as the opportunities in the current environment to really try and tackle some of the supply and demand side factors that have kept rates of employment for autistic people, and indeed for people with disability more generally, have kept those rates of employment so stubbornly low for so long? Is there an opportunity right now to try and change that and shift the dial on that as one of the kind of enduring outcomes of our pandemic recovery?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Look, I think this is an area that the acting Premier, and might I say before him the Premier, the resting Premier as I call him, have been very passionate about. Believe me, he's not resting all that much. He's keeping us busy. But look, we've put a fair bit of effort into integrating people with autism into our school and education network, and you'd appreciate that effort has to continue, and it's a vital first step in enabling their connection broadly into our economy. There is no doubt that we have very substantial and unacceptable levels of integration of people with autism into our workforce, and that to some extent underpins what I think are broader issues in the community around acceptance. And it's good to see that we're starting to see some advertising starting to take hold about how you deal with people with autism, and the best way that you can deal with them is make them part of the community. So in this budget, of course, we're putting some $384 million aside for skilling in the sector, and we know that through TAFE and other interventions, but we know that the only way that we'll be able to best integrate people with autism into the community is community acceptance, improved education, tailor-made interventions, and ultimately skills and training opportunities that can best meet their needs and their aspirations for the future. But the other thing we do need to recognise is that this is not just part of dollars in a budget. It's got to be a much more sustained effort for the community to recognise the full potential of people with autism and how we can integrate them into our communities, how they can see themselves as vital contributors to their communities and to achieve their full potential and aspirations for the future. So a lot more work needs to be done in this space, I accept that, but it's good to see we're starting to have a conversation and we're starting to recognise that our education system needs to focus on it, and ultimately so does our skilling system so that they can move into the workforce.
I take another question from the floor.
Thank you, Minister, for your presentation this morning. My name's Maxine. I'm from Deaf Victoria. I did ask a question at last year's online budget, really quite specifically in relation to Auslan access to government information and press conferences. And obviously you weren't able to drill down into that kind of information, but I didn't get any kind of other response or update on that. And displeasingly, we saw a massive reduction in the amount of interpreters at press conferences, and therefore the deaf community's access to important government information, not just related to the COVID pandemic, but also other things that our government is doing that they're paying their taxes for. It's really pleasing to see in this year's government that there are some really massive investments and commitments to workforce development, mental health and early intervention. Unfortunately, in 2021, there are still deaf people in educational settings working with teachers of the deaf who are not fluent in Auslan. There are still interpreters, in inverted commas, in schools that do not have NAATI accreditation. And these are the people that are supposedly giving access and early intervention to our deaf kids in these schools. And unsurprisingly, their educational outcomes are not great, with the average reading level of a deaf person who leaves school at grade 4 or 5 level, which is unacceptable in a rich country like Australia. So I'm really keen to know, following from Nicole's question in terms of how we're utilising people with disabilities, we have some very capable and well-educated deaf people with amazing Auslan fluency, but we're not able to get our point across. We're finding it very difficult to get consumer voices and deaf community voices heard when these programs are designed and implemented and delivered. We, as the peak advocacy body for deaf Victorians, have been denied a seat on the Ministerial Advisory Committee that reports to the Education Minister on the implementation of disability inclusion. And so I'm really keen to know how people with disabilities and their representative bodies are going to be genuinely and long-term included in the design and implementation of these kind of programs so that we can utilise these people for good in the community.
Thanks for that. Look, I've got to plead that I don't have the level of understanding of this particular area of investment, so I can undertake to make sure that we give you an appreciation of what investment has occurred in terms of Auslan interpreters and their capacity to participate in public service information. The other point I'd make is that the government is serious about its engagement and involvement of those representative of people with disabilities. I mean, we've put $92.7 million specifically into this budget for the purposes of improving our disability services. In terms of the question of engagement and the processes of involvement, I don't think I can really direct you to a process, particularly given it's the Education Minister, who happens to be the acting Premier at the moment, other than to say if there is a need for you to get greater engagement, we can pass that on to the acting Premier and let him know that you believe that you're being, to some extent, not included in the discussions in a way that you would see as satisfactory to your needs as an organisation.
Treasurer, this one from Daniel, who's watching online. What does this budget do to turn around the decline in foster carers as carers age, retire and are not being replaced?
I think I would have to take that question on notice, Mary. Certainly from the government's perspective, we do value the role that foster carers take. Exactly what's happened in terms of support for foster carers in the budget, I'd need to look at the history of funding and see exactly where we're at. But if, as a consequence of that question, I can be provided with details, I can give them back to Emma for the purposes of a reply.
Terrific. This one is a big topic that we haven't got to yet. This budget, from Anonymous by the way, this budget tinkers with stamp duty and property taxes. Has Victoria missed the opportunity to abolish stamp duty entirely and shift to a fairer, more progressive land tax-based system? You've heard that one before, I'm sure.
I have.
But still, we're not tackling this.
Well, because the consequence of tackling it would be to put a tax on the family home. I'm not sure that everybody agrees with the idea, well, we should get rid of stamp duty, it's a horrible impost. Not sure that they agree to the flip side of that debate, that it should be a tax on the family home, which would be the consequence of getting rid of stamp duty, unless, of course, you didn't want government to provide a substantial raft of social services to the community. So, you know, I often say to people, and the New South Wales government is flirting with an idea, but it's not about abolishing stamp duty. All they're proposing is to give people a choice to pay stamp duty or to flip it to a tax on the family home. So you
don't see that being ever really addressed by any Australian government anytime soon?
I think there is value in having the conversation, and certainly I am not critical of the work that the New South Wales government has done in this space, but quite frankly, at a time when the community has gone through enormous trauma, and they have, to start talking about a total recasting of the tax system, I think would be unreasonable. The other point to make is that the Commonwealth need to play a role here. If effectively the Commonwealth won't provide relief through the way that the GST is structured, then you automatically take a hit on your GST share by making the flip from stamp duty to a land tax system. The other broader point I think that's important here is that if you're going to have a question of tax reform, you have to also have a broader discussion about what tiers of government do what. So I've often said if you want to talk about reform of a tax system, all you're talking about how you collect a sufficient range of funds to at least do what you're doing at the moment, unless of course you believe in small government, which I hope there aren't too many people in this room that do. Small governments are the type of governments who believe in massive tax cuts while at the same time winding back the public service and winding back the level of service delivery to those most exposed in the community. So I don't subscribe to that philosophy, and I think many of you, because you've made careers in this area, would subscribe to it either. When people talk about we should do something about stamp duty, more often than not, it's an argument that says you should have smaller government, unless, of course, we're prepared to have the broader debate about what areas government should be involved in and what tier of government should appropriately provide for it. And certainly from my perspective, governments should be able to resource a level of activity that ensures, one, that they have independence of, for example, a government at a different tier being malevolent and seeking to direct how those funds are applied. But secondly, they need to be able to raise those monies in a way that is efficient for the economy so that we can effectively grow that economy. So my view at the moment, stamp duty is a reasonable tax in the sense that what we are seeing is a massive wealth event occurring in our community. Make no mistake. If you imagine this, we're raising about, well, I think it's $3,000 extra if you purchase a property over $2.5 million. If you had a property of equivalent value over the last 12 months, you would have seen that property appreciate by close to $300,000. So honestly, I don't see that it's unreasonable that the state says, in a time of low interest rates, when there is a massive wealth event occurring for people who own assets, and it's a standard truism of economics, low interest rates may lead to substantial increase in asset values because capital's trying to find a place to harbour and to get a return. Then in those circumstances it is appropriate that the community says, well, there are plenty of people suffering in this community as a consequence both of embedded disadvantage but also because essentially we have a circumstance where the community has had some very substantial losers out of this economic event, the pandemic. There have also been some very substantial winners. And just as Victorians pulled together to make sure that we got through the onset of the pandemic, I think the basic principle should be Victorians should help each other out. When some are doing well, they should make provision for those who aren't.
Sounds like you're warming up for that conversation with the property industry later today, aren't you?
I've been working on these lines, I'll tell you.
This from Hutch Hussain, Brotherhood of St Lawrence. We welcome the early investment, early intervention framework and this budget's investment in mental health. Will future budgets bring this lens to other areas of addressing poverty and building capacity of families and communities?
Yeah, well, I thank Hutch for the question, but look, this is a start, but it can't be a finish. So certainly from my perspective, there are jurisdictions across the world that are further advanced in this, and they don't have the distorted decision making that acute versus long-term benefit investment looks like. But it will require a massive mindset in the way that treasuries operate, in the way that departments think about their choices that they want to make to government. And ultimately, I think it will have a very substantial benefit upon the wellbeing of the community. So yes, this is a start, but it's not a finish, and we've got a long journey to go. But I intend progressively increasing the scope of an early intervention investment framework such that we get to make coherent decisions about avoiding problems rather than dealing with the manifestation of them. It's about prevention is better than cure, and it's certainly about making sure that as a community we get real value for state interventions.
I think we have another question from floor.
Good morning, and thank you, Treasurer. Danny Schwartz from Playgroup Victoria. I might offer a term that the sector uses for your exciting new accounting structure, universal proportionalism. That is that everyone gets everything, and those that need more get more. And in terms of the structure that I understood, given that I didn't do so well in my form for accounting, was that in terms of what you're looking for is that invest some now, and you'll probably need to invest less later on because of what it is that you do. And Playgroup is a great framework for that. And so I'd like to offer an opportunity to put your toe in the water in terms of this new model in relation to Playgroup, that we were funded by the government a couple of years ago, and then it was followed up by philanthropy to run a program called All Come Out to Play, a respectful relationship program. And in terms of the current conversation that's been going on over the last number of months in terms of gender violence, etc., and gender equity, this program talks with parents and children at the same time about the concept of telling girls to take risks, giving girls the opportunity to think about taking risks, about talking to boys, about having empathy, for example. And in our evaluation that we've done on it, parents have said, over 80% of parents have said, that they would change the way that they parent based on the messages that they heard at the same time as their children, unique to Playgroup. So I'm asking whether you might consider using this new accounting model for a program that we've already got established, so we don't need to spend money, and it's been evaluated, to look at, well, if we do this, will there, what's the change in terms of the potential opportunity cost of less money needing to be spent in areas of domestic violence, for example, and family violence, based on the fact that parents and children are changing culture and changing the way that they think early?
Well, universal proportionalism, I'm going to have to try and get my head around that.
You're welcome to use that.
Look, thank you very much for next year's budget bid. Look, this is going to open up opportunities for everybody who thinks that they have a demonstrable way of avoiding long-term costs for the state. I can't say where the best investment would be made. I know that we've put our toe in the water on a couple that we feel confident we'll be able to prove up the system. And as we demonstrate the wins that we get on the board, then we'll be able to expand it. The most obvious thing to do would be to apply this in areas where we expect that the investment will be able to demonstrate a real value and a return. And it won't happen overnight, is all I'm saying. We won't necessarily say, well, look, we've absolutely flipped the way that government operates now. We're not going to put any money into acute presentation of problems. It'll all be for the long-term well-being of the community because it's money better spent. Were we to do that, we would have some pretty dramatic problems in the community for the from the overt manifestations of a problem that demanded immediate care. So governments have to get that balance right. And what I'm saying here is not that we're flicking a switch to avoidance rather than care. What I'm saying is we are now creating an instrument, a framework, and some investments that give us an opportunity to assess how we can best value this up against the acute presentation problems. So just as our social impact bonds, is about trying to find where we can intervene and get good outcomes. We've been pretty selective as we've rolled them out because we want to have some confidence that they work. And believe me, all the evidence that we're getting back, Paul, thanks, is that it is working and we're getting the sort of results we want. I don't want to tread too fast into this for fear of failure. And the practical consequence of failure will be that there is little willingness for departments or others who lose funds as a consequence of it to entertain these ideas going forward. So already we've found some interventions where we believe that we can take funds out of long-term expenditure from the acute presentation side by putting the money into the early intervention side. So I can't speak specifically of the issue that you raised, but I also would caution people to recognise that this will be done in a way that government, Treasury bureaucrats understand the value of the dollars to be extracted. Any departmental officer coming forward and saying, I've got a great early intervention strategy here, can you give me money? They have to understand that the flip side of that conversation is, sure, but I'm taking money out at the back end on the acute side of the presentations. So they have to be willing to make that sort of balance in terms of their bid to government. And the reason this only works if you can get that longer term acute saving is that effectively all we're doing is we're feeding both ends of the equation, which is great if you've got a limitless budget, but it's not so great if you've got to make choices between acute and early intervention.
Treasurer, I'm conscious that our time with you is running out and you've got to run out and spend some money, but hopefully you've got just time for one last question.
Oh, thank you, Tim. I'm Jennifer Webber with the Caroline Chisholm Society, and with specialisation in the first 1,000 days and unborn reports work, circumventing the need for women to enter into the child protection system, as well as keeping them out of the system as well, with our early intervention work. And a mentor of mine once suggested to me that when approaching people like yourself, or with regard to any funding or advice, if you ask for the money, you're likely to get the advice, and if you ask for advice, you're likely to get the money. So my question to you is, in fact, what would your advice be with regard to small organisations like ours and applying the gender lens onto procurement, so that the consortium model breaks down for organisations like ours, because we are quite small and specialist, but yet when it comes to the procurement processes, we tend to miss out because we've got to go around asking all sorts of organisations, do they happen to be considered putting in consortiums for funding? So we're a bit like cap in hand, having to go around to larger organisations, sometimes for money and sometimes for advice. So I'd be really interested in what you would think about that, applying that gender lens to procurement.
Sorry, I just need a bit more information. The procurement you're talking about is how organisations seeking to get justice in terms of the allocation to...
That's right. So when new funds are being put out, and we approach departments to put our case forward and to demonstrate our specialisation, particularly if there's unfunded work going on and we put ourselves forward, we're redirected back to procurement, but the procurement process is set up in such a way that it's more fitted to a consortium approach. And I understand government wanting one banker approach in that consortium, but it is to the detriment of the smaller agencies who tend to be the organisations working with women and vulnerability at risk.
Well, I'm sorry that I can't give you a great insight into this, other than to say that what we've tried to do as a government is encourage organisations to cooperate together. Largely, you'd appreciate when government has strategies and policies that they're seeking to implement and to partner with the community sector, we like to make sure that it can be that those strategies can be broadly applied across the community, and if smaller organisations have less capacity to do it, the best way to augment your ability to be taken as a broader provider is to have those partnerships put in place, and we've encouraged it in the provision of legal services, legal aid services across the state for there to be a consolidation of advisory bodies. It doesn't mean that you can't get there, it just means that it makes it more difficult. It makes it difficult because you've got to comply with the procurement requirements. That is, you're constantly filling in applications for grants. You start behind the eight ball because of the size of the organisation and the scope of the capacity. So enabling some sort of partnerships probably is the best solution for the government in this perspective. I'm happy for us to talk to you a little bit about how our procurement or grant allocation process, if it were one or the other, could be enhanced by the facilitation of partnerships. But the one thing that the government has to be conscious of is if we have a strategy, we want to roll it out broadly into the community. Unless we can have confidence that that strategy has a take-up, has the proponents for delivery of it have the capacity to broadly roll it out, then we're making choices about very precise interventions in the area of activity that you have. And whilst those things that you do are clearly very important, it may well be that government's looking for broader value right across the community. So getting that balance right will be important, but maybe we should have a conversation about how partnerships can be facilitated for the purposes of intervention around broader social procurement strategies.
Treasurer, I think we have now run out of time with you as Emma comes up to the stage. I thought maybe we should have a look at the word association results. Ryan, oh, there you go. Positive, right in the middle there. Optimistic, cautious, hopeful, balancing act. What do you think, Treasurer, of those?
I'm wondering what demotivated means.
And you've also got a cautious and a bold. Are you feeling demotivated?
Well, I've been feeling reasonably enthusiastic up until I saw that. Look, if I had a word that I'd use to describe this budget, it's people. It's as simple as that. It could be caring. It makes you sound a little bit soft if you're a treasurer and you talk about the things that you care for, but quite frankly, every choice we make in a financial sense is about the things we care for. So you judge this budget on the things that we care most for, you'll see that's where the greatest level of investment has gone, and we care most for the well-being of the Victorian people.
Well, Treasurer, good luck. Good luck. And good luck indeed if that word association exercise happens at your property industry meeting. Be interesting to see what comes out of that.
I reckon I'll get a few adjectives.
Let's thank the Treasurer.
Treasurer, before you leave, can I, a few things I guess I really wanted to mention. The first is a sincere thank you to you, to your team from the Treasurer's Office, and also to your colleagues. You're incredibly generous in terms of working with the community sector more broadly. It is fantastic to work with you, your team, your parliamentary colleagues. We really, really appreciate it. On behalf of Stella Avramopoulos, the VCOSS chair, myself and everyone in this room, I really want to emphasise that. I think a couple of the comments that you just made then, actually, I know some of the comments that you made in your budget last year, which was around people matter more than the bottom line, and thinking around the investment that the true investment that this government has made, and I think a very progressive government that's focused on and prioritised on unprecedented investment in family violence, in housing and in mental health. We know that there is always more to do, and we are appreciative of the fact that we can keep talking to you about that, but also hearing your comments today about wellbeing. And you know that VCOSS is really working very hard for that wellbeing budgeting approach along the same lines as New Zealand, and your comments today were really heartening. So I think we're looking forward to having more of those conversations with you. But I really want to pass on my sincere thanks. As you said, this is our fourth budget breakfast together. It is your candour and your willingness to take questions from the broader community sector is very much appreciated. By way of thanks, there's a couple of gifts that we wanted to give you. So apparently there is no such thing as a free lunch, but given that you're giving out vouchers to people at the moment, which we think is a really good idea, we think it's a bit of fun, we would like to give you a free lunch. There's such a thing in terms of enjoying Charcoal Lane, so we'll pass that on to your office as well. But we also, in your budget speech on Thursday, you made the point that the national economy is roaring because Victoria has put a tiger in the tank. Well, we hope that that tiger keeps roaring and roars for Victorians of all stripes so that no one is left behind. And so it's my pleasure, therefore, to give you this small gift of thanks for being here today, and its name is Wellbeing.
Thank you very much, Treasurer. I want you to take that everywhere with you today, okay? And work it into conversations. Talk to it a little bit. Well, thank you very much for your time. Now, as we say, we're going to be continuing here with our panel discussion. As you leave, we'll be talking behind your back about your budget. You, of course, are saying it's wonderful. We've got some fair indication there. A few of you actually agree with that as well, but let's have a listen to what an expert panel is thinking as well. Emma King's going to stay up here in this panel. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Danielle Wood from the Grattan Institute, CEO, and Professor David Hayward, RMIT economist. If you could welcome them to the stage. Okay, so we'll just get ourselves sorted, I guess, with microphones here. Sort this out. One more coming up. I just want to see faces of the people as the Treasurer's leaving with that. That's yeah. There we go. And wellbeing farewells the room. Well, while we're waiting for the mics anyway, I'll start with you, Emma. Obviously, we'll just start with the biggest question. Your hot take on the budget and what the Treasurer said this morning.
Hot take on the budget and what the Treasurer said this morning is that the beginning of the focus towards wellbeing. So I think what we've seen in the previous budgets is that real focus on people, and I was really heartened today to hear the Treasurer's comments on wellbeing. So for me, we've started to see that real approach towards wellbeing. We've seen, I think it's fair to say, the unprecedented investment in mental health. I think we expected to see, we obviously knew there was going to be spending there, but to be candid, it was bigger than we expected. So that was a really great approach. I think it would also go to there's always more to do, and looking at some of the key things that you touched on, such as, moving beyond drip feeding and those sorts of things as well. But overall, incredibly positive. We've seen such a significant shift over the last couple of budgets in particular.
Danielle?
So when I wrote a piece about the budget last week, I sort of described the Treasurer as engaging in that kind of high wire balancing act that you see at the circus, trying to walk this quite fine line with different priorities pushing in different directions. So I think, priority one was clearly to back in the recovery. So even though we have seen that really strong jobs growth that the Treasurer pointed to, we're in a really different world to past crises. So the macroeconomic discussion is really different. We don't have the Reserve Bank with any more room to move on interest rates. So we're actually relying on government to push forward the recovery. So we saw it at the federal budget. Rather than talking about budget repair, they're now saying they want to push unemployment down with a 4 in front of it. I think that's the right approach, and we don't want the state governments to be cross purposes. So I think it's great that we're seeing an emphasis as well on job creation recovery. The second force is the desire for a big new social spend in mental health. Also very much welcome that, and I think wellbeing has shifted in the language. I think the other thing that shifted in the language, which is really interesting, which we've certainly been advocating for a long time, is that language he was using around the double duty of each dollar. So that idea that when you're spending in social services, you are delivering something that the community needs and you're creating jobs. And historically, when we've talked about job creation in budgets, it's been almost exclusively about infrastructure, and by that I mean physical infrastructure, construction, manufacturing. It's just so refreshing, honestly, to actually recognise these are jobs too. Every time you create a mental health worker or a new nurse or someone working in homelessness services, that's a job adding value to the community too. So I think, to me, that's actually a really significant shift. And the third thing that obviously the Treasurer is trying to balance is the long-term fiscal sustainability question. It is much easier to handle debt right now with interest rates being low, but over the 4 years of the budget, we do see debt continuing to grow as a share of the economy. We see interest costs as a share of revenue growing. So I think the Treasurer had to look at measures to try and ensure that long-term sustainability. I'm sure we'll talk about the tax measures. I think by and large I'm supportive. There's some individual ones I don't particularly like. But I think, so he's walking this line. I think he's done a reasonable job, to be honest, of trying to balance those competing considerations.
David, and I think we've got a mic for you there. Yeah. What's your take?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary. Look, I think this is a terrific budget. I was looking back at the figures this morning because Raf pointed out to me last week I've done 29 budget lockups. I didn't want him to say that on air, but it was 29. And I went back through my spreadsheets to have a look at where we sit now compared to any other point in the last 30 years of spending and taxing. And I reckon if I had have thought of like the most optimistic scenario when the government first came to office in 2014, I would have thought that we would have had operating spending up around about 14.5% of the economy. This year it's going to be about 19.5%, right? That's a massive increase. It's going to come down a bit next year because it's got to, because a lot of the measures were pandemic related. If I was thinking about infrastructure spending, I would have hoped that it would have hit 3% of GDP. And it's going to be about 4%, right? That's up from 1% when they came to office. That massive increase. We're talking about a huge expansion of government involvement. Just the measures that were announced, the new initiatives. I know these some sound huge, and they are huge. Typically, we might have expected new initiatives of around about $2.5 billion. That would be a good budget. We got $5 billion in this consolidating. This was not a consolidating budget, believe me. This was an expansionary budget coming on the back of a hugely expansionary budget last time. This is a budget that is historically unprecedented in its social policy initiatives, and it sets it so far apart from the other states and territories, it is almost unbelievable. And what I think is a tremendous achievement is the support that the government has got more broadly for that agenda. It's a tremendous achievement. So what did I think, Mary? I thought it was a tremendous budget, and I think we should be really, really pleased. I know there's more to be done, but gee, the gap before they came was huge. It's far less a gap now. I'm quite happy to pick up on some of the major things that I think have been happening over the last few years that we should not forget, because these are historically significant times.
I think that we'll get to the sort of historical experimentation, as it were, with this amount of money in this circumstance in a while. But just briefly, I might just in opposite order. Are there big misses with this? You're obviously pretty glowing about it. What would all of you think about what is missing?
I think where we started from where we are now, there's a huge amount that could have been done, Mary. One of the things that I was really pleased about, I thought the mental health stuff was just brilliant. So this is the second time we've seen the government pick a really difficult policy area and follow a playbook. Royal Commission, right? Get the Royal Commission done. Get all the submissions in. Get broad support for something major. The Royal Commission this time has said we don't just want spending, we want baked-in funding. And the government's come up with this solution, which is actually very good, Mary. It's payroll tax. Payroll tax, believe me, is not the bad tax that keeps getting presented. We've made it worse and worse by having so many exemptions, but we've actually funding a huge social policy initiative with enormous dividends by introducing a new hypothecated tax. Massive structural change. Massive. That's sort of like a European-style social policy intervention. Don't miss it. It is significant. It's massive. And it's possibly setting things up for something further down the track. So I think in a way we've been so obsessed with the stamp duty land tax thing that we've forgotten about another approach which we're kind of seeing rolled out.
So the thing that's missing is that potentially this can be applied in the future, you're thinking?
I think
as well, with other things.
it's the structural reforms, and I
Yep.
think it may be. I would have liked to have asked the Treasurer that question, but I thought somebody else might. Mary, I was expecting you to do it.
Okay, I've been marked down. What about you, Danielle? What do you think in terms of the misses?
Yeah, look, it's a hard question because I think, clearly there's an envelope which the government can work in. They've actually pretty significantly expanded the envelope, so I don't like to be too critical about this area or that area that could have dealt with more funding. I also think the thing they've done really well is to pick a few signatures and go hard over time. So we've seen family violence, we saw social housing last year, and this year mental health. Some contrast with the federal government there, where they're sort of dipping their toes into a few areas but don't look like they're kind of willing to go the whole hog on those. I think as an economist, maybe the criticism would be the lack of vision on economic reform. So there's some stuff around skills. I'm interested to see how that plays out. Not really willing to talk about the stamp duty land tax swap, I thought was interesting, and a bit of a contrast in the message around, oh goodness me, we can't, put a tax on the family home, but property owners have had this massive windfall and they should pay. And that is actually an argument that you could broaden the base of land tax and reduce stamp duty. So I think over time I would like to see a little bit more on the economic reform front, but that's definitely not to downplay just how significant this shift has been.
Emma?
I think for me, one of the noticeable things was around the revenue through poker machines, and looking at the fact that had actually decreased significantly during COVID for the range of reasons, including the fact that they were closed, and now it's projected to increase, I think, by about 50%. Over the next year, and I thought that there was a real opportunity to actually, I know government gets hungry for that money, but it's such a blight on our society, and I thought there was an opportunity there to actually say, you know what, we haven't had that revenue coming in for a year, let's do something about that.
It seems to me, seems to everyone, that you look at this past year and epidemiologists are looking at a real life experiment, anthropologists looked at a real life experiment, sociologists and so forth, and economists now are looking at this happening all around the world, this whole different way of doing things. The stakes are really high, aren't they, in terms of getting this right? What would you have to say about that, Danielle or David?
So you are right. We are kind of in uncharted territory. So it goes to what I was saying at the start. So we've come out of this crisis. Normally we would rely on the Reserve Bank to be doing the heavy lifting for recovery. We can't do that this time round. And the other point is really, what are we recovering to? So if people think back to the economy in 2019, we had far too many people unemployed. We hadn't seen wages grow for 6 years. Consumption was weak, investment is weak. And we were trapped in what economists now call secular stagnation, which is just a way of saying really you're kind of trapped in second gear. And the consensus has been, well, that's not what we should be aiming for on the other side of this. We should actually be trying to push the economy harder, bring unemployment down. The great thing about bringing unemployment down is, all those, we were talking about bringing disabled people into the workforce. All of a sudden, when you've got a tight labour market, firms have to make those decisions to actually take a chance on someone a little bit out of the box, or train people that you otherwise wouldn't bother training because you're just, bringing in someone from overseas, or, So I think there's some great social side effects to low unemployment, gets wages moving again, and then the idea is that the economic momentum kicks in. But it is an experiment. The risk is that things get a little bit hotter than the government anticipates, wages start growing, inflation gets out of control. I'm not terribly worried about that. I think the Reserve Bank can move to control that, but that is the risk that some economists are worried about. So on balance, I think the risks of not doing enough here is greater than the risks of doing too much, but we should acknowledge that it is kind of a new thing that we're trying here.
David?
Look, it's a really good question, Mary. I actually think the world's changing. I think we're seeing a shift from the kind of politics that has captured the world for the last 30 years, and we're seeing this new environment of a lot of money being available and very low interest rates change the way governments are thinking. Just looking at state politics, there was a conventional wisdom for 30 years that states wouldn't intervene to stimulate the economy after the last time that was tried in the late 80s. So it's just conventional wisdom, you'd leave it up to the federal government. What the state Labor government's done this time is show, yes, you can stimulate the economy, and it does work. Those employment figures that the Treasurer talked about are astonishing. They set a target, a bold target of 200,000 jobs by 2022. They exceeded it in less than a year. Through massive stimulus, and everybody is saying this is a good thing. You know, the Reserve Bank has said this is a good thing. We've got this really strange situation at the moment where there used to be a lot of tension between all tiers of federal government and state governments. Now we've got the Reserve Bank saying to the states, go ahead and stimulate and we'll buy your bonds. Go right ahead. They're not listening to what the Federal Treasury is saying, but they've changed the whole way of understanding economic fiscal policy in Australia. But it's not just Australia, it's around the world. The times have changed, the politics have shifted, and I think Labor in Victoria has been very much ahead of the pack.
Economic textbooks were written all over the place. Emma, there's one thing to stimulate employment and growth and so forth, but is a part of you fearing that we're not going to see enough, the needle move on enough of these social issues in quick enough time for it to be then politically palatable for the next government to do the same thing as this one did? In other words, you know, we've been spending a lot of money on family violence in Victoria for quite some time, but the numbers aren't really showing it, it seems. So when it comes to things like mental health and so forth, even with this big investment and the idea that it's going to be accountable, are you fearful that these are the big social changes that are going to nonetheless outlast even this great political will?
I think it's a really good point, because we often see that need for government to be seen to deliver within that one political cycle, and these are sometimes longer game in terms of looking at where the investment is. A couple of things that sit around that. One is looking at the workforce and looking at the investment, for example, in the most recent budget, last week, it feels like it was longer, around mental health. And we know that we need a really highly skilled workforce in that area we don't necessarily have the people right now. So thinking about the fact that actually it's going to take time to train people up, etc. So there's a bit of a lag there, for want of a better term. So I think that's right. And because I was heartened by the Treasurer's remarks around that, you know, the well-being and then potentially moving beyond that one budget cycle, that one electoral cycle, I think it's another, I'd love to watch that happen, because I think you're right in terms of looking at, and I think all of us know stories of people who work in the sector more so around, you know, when it comes to family violence, we're seeing figures continue to escalate, and we're seeing that there's still frustration in a system that is not delivering for the people that it needs to. So there's a part around saying, how do we keep sticking there, but also how do we therefore move beyond some of the things such as you mentioned earlier, the drip funding, where people are only funded for 1 year or have implement for 1 year. And so the desire for the workforce to stay in the sector is that's pretty hard. And then also for services to deliver, because fundamentally the role that we all have is actually how do we make people's lives better? How do we deliver for people? So there's a number of things I think that sit together around that, and bringing maybe what is a very fragmented approach to making that, to synthesising that. And I think that's a longer game.
David, you mentioned how far ahead this puts Victoria from the rest of the country. From an economist's point of view, I'm just curious, if one state goes this hard in this way, what can we expect in terms of, you know, the ripple effect? Is it all about the politics?
Look, I think it's a really... I thought your last question was really good too, Mary. Putting the two together, it's an interesting case of back in England, back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the Blair government decided that they were going to put a lot of money into the national health system, and they committed to increasing spending to the European average, right, from far below to the European. So they put all this money in, and guess what? Like, nothing really changed. And so the government said, well, hang on a minute, we've just put all this money in and nothing's really changed. Like, there's no clear impact on outputs or... because the problem was they were making up for decades of neglect, right? So you had to put a lot in. And I think it's like the family violence thing. It's a really, really deep problem. And I think what we've got to be careful of is not saying, look, expect everything will be sunshine tomorrow. It's going to take a lot. It's going to take quite a while. But to come back to your most recent question, Mary, I think the interesting one in this case is for the other states, they're going, all right, well, look, they've just increased their payroll tax, but you've got this amazing reform in mental health, which could have a tremendous payback for business. Now, that would be interesting, won't it? What about if business goes, guess what, we get that. So we'll actually, rather than leave Victoria, we'll come to Victoria, because that's a really big saving. That's a really good, because, you know, most people are touched by mental health issues. So it's a really interesting putting down the gauntlet about an alternative approach to the way you try and run the state. And it's really very much putting social policy as an investment, not as consumption and welfare. So that's how I'd answer that. Yeah.
Danielle, what's your confidence in terms of it sort of changing that larger conversation about how we look at these things?
I think it's hard to shift for the reason that you pointed to in that initial question, Mary, in that so the Treasurer was interesting on that idea of, we put a bit into prevention, that means a bit less on acute. It does leave a government open in the sense that those investments have very long payoff horizon, particularly very early intervention, childhood interventions. You're not seeing the benefit that's 20, 30 years sometimes. And so I think the risk is that you have an opposition that says, oh, look, they're underspending over here on acute, we'll do more here, we'll pull up the rug on those early interventions. So it's something where you actually, I think, really need to build up bipartisan support. It goes well beyond one election cycle, so you need to really develop and keep, all of us in this room have to tell the story about why this is important, because we need everyone to see that payoff, because otherwise there is room for people to move opportunistically, I think, on this space. So I think that's why the step towards the wellbeing budget is important as well, because you're actually showing people the link. We're investing here because we want to do Y at some point in the future. So I think it's a positive approach, but I think it's not one without political risk.
I think we're running out of time here, so I'll just ask for sort of final observations. David, what question haven't I asked again?
They're very good. Look, the one thing that I'll finish on, Mary, is that I think the risk from the budget is around property, right? And my thinking is that what happened during the pandemic recession last year was that people couldn't buy and sell houses. And if you look at I was looking at the figures yesterday. What else do you do on a Sunday, Mary? Look at housing loan figures, don't you? The number of housing loans that were issued from sort of the June quarter through to the end of the year were down by about 25%. It was a massive fall because we couldn't buy and sell houses. You couldn't leave your home, right? As soon as you lifted the lockdown, well, of course, people came back, didn't they? But you've got about 12,000 transactions waiting to hit the market. All these subsidies, stamp duty, concessions, well, that's what's happened. So it's gone off like a firecracker. We've loaded up a slingshot and it's gone off. But it's likely it's going to run out of steam soon. And it's likely to hit just as those new taxes come into being. That's what I said to the Treasurer. And you know what they'll say? That we told you this would happen. We told you introduce a tax, and look, you've killed the property industry. But I do see that as a risk for them going forward. There's a lot of politics around it. The Treasurer's copping a lot of flack from the property sector at the moment, and do bear that in mind in the way that you, I guess, present the budget to colleagues. This is a very good, very, very good budget for social policy, and I think it's really important to bear in mind there are risks for the government moving forward.
Danielle?
Yeah, look, I agree on the risk in terms of the property industry. Always shout very loudly when tax changes are proposed, and I remember having a battle on capital gains tax and negative gearing a few years ago, and that's almost scared governments off going there again. I'm less negative than David on the kind of property price effect. I think it is actually largely an interest rate effect, which is, as the Treasurer said, so when you decrease interest rates, the Reserve Bank numbers suggest that you increase, every 1 percentage point decline increases property prices by 10% in the short term and 30% in the long term. This is an extraordinary shift in our economy. The divergence between house prices and incomes over the past 20 years is massive. So I think, although I'm not a fan of the stamp duty changes, I am a big fan of the windfall gain tax and land tax, and I think that the Treasurer has a good story to tell there. Most people understand that this is a one-off massive increase in wealth for the people that happen to be in the market, a huge disincentive for people that are trying to get into the market from doing so. And so I think it is saleable, but totally agree the property industry will continue to scream.
And Emma, your final observations?
My final observation, so building, I won't repeat what's been said because totally agree. I think the piece to me, if I think back a year and where we were, comes to vaccinations, because I think about where we could, we're moving towards winter, where we could potentially be, and I look at the optimism, etc., in the budget, which I welcome and I think is spot on, but I think about that risk of heading towards winter, the issue around vaccinations, and it always strikes me when I talk to my colleagues in other states, because it feels like, we had the lockdown that we did and they didn't, and it feels like we're in parallel universes. So when I think around the country, let alone the world, I think around how much is predicated actually on people being vaccinated and being well and being able to move around and being able to go to jobs and those sorts of things. So that's probably one of the things that's in my mind, because if you think back a year, I know I'm looking at today and thinking of the hybrid event, which previously we were on the other side, we always have, over 300 people in the room, and thinking about how differently we've got to do everything now. And I remember hearing a comment not long ago around going, someone said, we thought it was all over. I'm like, did you really? And so I guess to me, that's what's in my mind all the time as well, is to say, well, it's we've got this amazing, really, you think back 5 years, we would never have thought we could have had the couple of budgets we've just had, and to think, but now it's actually that part around saying, well-being, a big part of that is actually getting our population vaccinated, having people safe and being able to move around again.
Absolutely. I've got my jab. I hope everyone in this room who's able to get their jab has gotten their jab. Thank you so much. And can we please thank Danielle and David for joining us in this panel, and obviously Emma as well. Thank you to everyone who's obviously here and who's participated online. Sorry we couldn't get to your questions, all those questions from online, so do apologise. There is going to be a fully captioned video recording of this event. It's going to be posted online in a few days. And a personal plea from me, as I say, we're really interested. We should be telling more stories of your stories, the stories you hear and the people that you're dealing with. So please pepper my inbox. It's an open invitation. All those stories that we aren't telling, please let us know. So goodbye. Hope everyone enjoys their day, even if they don't have a toy tiger.
Can I just say, just before we quickly go, a huge thank you to Mary, who's done the most phenomenal job today. Asked some very tough questions of the Premier, and Jen, I was thinking of you in terms of the housing question around when is our going to be zero, actually, a number in terms of people homeless. So thank you. You've done the most wonderful job. So a sincere thank you.